there's a lot of really positive work that federal legislators can do to help us curb both the public health crisis that's been brought on by COVID-19, but also the economic crisis that's been brought on by the pandemic. I think that, first and foremost, we have to make sure that our frontline workers have the resources that they need to be safe and to be successful in their fight to take care of all of us. So at the top of my list is making sure that every hospital in our district and in Missouri, and really even across the country, has the PPE that they need, have the testing that they need, have just the resources that they need to combat this virus. On top of that, we also have to make sure that we're taking care of our workers. And that means providing hazard pay to people who are working in industries like large plant facilities where close contact is kind of a necessary part of the job. We want to make sure that there's hazard pay in there for those workers so that we are protecting them. We also need to make sure that working families can make ends meet during this time. So many people are experiencing layoffs, are experiencing a loss of hours at their workplace if they aren't laid off. And so I think that in the first CARES Act, providing that $1,200 a month to working people really help folks get by. And I think that we need another stimulus like that to continue helping our working families. On the, more public health end of things, I would like to see increased funding for state and local governments to help with contract tracing and to help with providing testing in large cities and in really rural areas. I talk with folks who will line up outside of a testing facility and within a couple hours there aren't any tests left. And so we do really still have a shortage of that. And if we want to get this virus under control, we have to make sure that testing is widely available, that it is accurate, and that the turnaround time is quick. Because until we curb the public health crisis, we cannot stop the economic crisis. Yes, I think that the Paycheck Protection Program has been helpful to a number of small businesses. I would like to see it modified slightly, though. My opponent, Vicky Hartzler, took almost $500,000 for her own business, and we saw many multi-million-dollar publicly traded companies receive millions of dollars from this program. That is really not how the American people want their taxpayer dollars spent. They want to help the small businesses in their communities, the mom and pop shops run by folks that they know, stay afloat. And so we need to make sure that there's sufficient oversight such that the wealthy and well-connected in the world do not get ahead and do not cut to the front of the line like Vicky Hartzler did. The Small Business Association Inspector General actually released a report that said that rural businesses owned by women and businesses owned by people of color actually had less access to PPP funding. So when rethinking about putting this program forward again, we need to make sure that communities that serve those businesses and those business owners are equipped with banking institutions that can actually service the loans. Many folks who just operate on what they make do not have longstanding credit relationships with banks. That's one of the reasons that so many businesses who don't normally operate on revolving credit weren't able to get to the front of the line. And so we need to take into account those communities and those businesses. And the last thing that I would say is I would like to see that expanded beyond just small businesses, but also provide relief to independent contractors, to people who are self-employed, and to some of our farming families, because those groups were left out of PPP the last time around. And that was really devastating for their businesses that simply just didn't fit the parameters of how PPP was drafted the first time around. So I do think that the federal government should provide additional funding for working people. I think that another round of stimulus is important. I think that expanding unemployment benefits is important. One of the great things that the CARES Act did the first time around was expanding those unemployment benefits to independent contractors and to self-employed people and to people who had jobs lined up but then lost them before even being able to start. And so by expanding the scope of who can benefit from that program and who can have access to those necessary resources, we were really able to help millions of people and keep them afloat during this hard time and help keep their families afloat. And so I think that that's something that the federal government can do and should do. I also think that it's important for the federal government to make sure that people experiencing the effects of COVID-19, whether they've had to be hospitalized or receive testing, ensure that that is free. I think that it's important that insurance companies aren't making a profit off of people who have fallen ill to this virus, and that we cover the treatment and the testing necessary to help contain it. This is something that I care a lot about. I am a lawyer, and for the first 5 years of from being in law school to practicing law, I was really involved with criminal defense work, a lot of public defense work, and I had the great honor of representing a man named Sean Williams, who at the age of 19 was wrongfully incarcerated for a murder that he did not commit. He was 2 states away when the murder occurred, and the detective in charge of the case basically framed him for this crime that he went away to jail for 25 years. We were able to get Mr. Williams out of prison in 2018. And so the very first thing that is so crucial in police reform is that we have to end qualified immunity. The detective who framed him, who falsified evidence, who hid evidence, who coerced witnesses, he is still walking scot-free with his pension. And we have to hold bad cops accountable for being criminals. Other things that we just have to do, we have to end no-knock warrants. We have to end chokeholds. We have to get rid of mandatory minimums. We have to make sure that our concept of justice is actually just and not just punitive, and not especially punitive based on someone's skin tone. And that is currently where we are. And so I think that as a nation, we are in a moment right now where we are having a really important conversation about what we want our Justice Department to look like. Do we want it to be just punishment, 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 or are we actually trying to help people? That in the pursuit of safety, we are also helping people and thereby strengthening our communities through investments in mental health, through investments in behavioral health, through investments really in education, which can make a big difference, through investments in business. There's so much that we can do to improve policing, but until we take care of some of these baseline problems like qualified immunity, no-knock warrants, demilitarizing the police is another imperative. I'm an Army wife. My husband is currently deployed, and I can tell you that the equipment that my husband uses has no place on the streets of civilians and in neighborhoods where families live. And, there's even a whole separate code that military officers and military service members have to live by. When their rifle goes off, they are held accountable for that. That is not always the case for police officers. And so if they are going to be in civilian streets using military weapons, not subject to military law, that is an inequity, and we have to fix that. So I think that there are a number of common sense things that we can do. I think there are a number of things that the vast majority of people support. And so we start there, but we always continue the discussion because there's always more that we can do to create a more just society. So I think that gun violence prevention is extraordinarily important for a whole host of communities. I shot my first gun when I was 5 out on a farm in mid-Missouri. I was 10 years old the first time that I got to go hunting by myself. I was 20 years old the first time I hid under my desk when there was an armed shooter 2 doors down from my classroom. It is a myth. It is a myth that to be a good Missourian who supports hunting and, loves the family tradition of that, you have to be an obstinate to gun violence prevention. It is not mutually exclusive. You can want to hunt with your family and want your kids to be safe at school at the same time. And the way that we do that is by, again, just looking at very common sense solutions. And that includes universal background checks on all gun sales. It includes making sure that we have fully invested in youth hunter safety courses. It means making sure that we repeal laws that prevent citizens from suing firearm manufacturers. It is wild that the federal government would protect an entire industry from lawsuits when it doesn't offer that protection to any other industry. That is an unfair competitive advantage. We have to repeal that law. I think that it's important to continue to enforce the laws that we already have to make sure that people are being held accountable to them. But then I also think that we have to look at, communities in my district specifically that are really affected by gun violence, and that is rural people who die by rural suicide at very alarming rates, and it's veterans who also die by suicide at very high rates. And we have to make sure that we are taking care of the people in our community. We have to make sure that mental health resources are available. We have to make sure that when people need help, when people need financial help, when people need educational help, when people just need someone to support them, that we make it acceptable to ask for that help. Right now, asking for help in so many communities is frowned upon. And when you are out there going through a really tough time on your own and you feel like you can't ask for the help you need, you're not going to get it. And so we have to make sure that not only are resources available, but that we also, come together and understand that supporting one another is important. I do not think that the federal government should impose itself into a state. It should not impose itself onto a city unless it is invited and the Constitution agrees with that. I think that a lot of what we have seen across the country lately is really in violation of the Constitution. I think that, Kansas City is an interesting situation because its policing is not controlled locally. And that is a big problem. And I think that it's important that when you are policing local communities, that local communities have the oversight of that policing authority. And I think it's important that local communities have a say in how their communities are policed. And I don't think that what is currently going on really allows for that to happen. And it should. No, I do not support repealing the Affordable Care Act. Repealing the Affordable Care Act will leave 20 million people instantly without health insurance, and that is not acceptable. I think that, we live in a society where companies profit off of sick people. They get to decide how likely it is you're going to need a doctor. And if you aren't likely to need a doctor, they put you in one box. And if you are likely to need a doctor, they're going to put you in another box. And all the people who are likely to need healthcare get charged a ton of money because the insurance company cares about profiting no matter who needs what. And that has created an industry that is where human beings are disincentivized from seeking medical treatment. That is not a sustainable solution. That is not a solution that we should promote here in the United States. And I think the Affordable Care Act is really the first step in making sure that everyone is actually incentivized to go see a doctor, that everyone has the opportunity and the access and can afford to go see a doctor. That really should be everyone's goal. And by repealing the Affordable Care Act, you're taking away protections for people with pre-existing conditions, those people who have a tough time getting insured by private health insurers, those people who were paying astronomical prices out of pocket, those people who were really struggling whether to pay the mortgage or get their chemo treatment. That is not acceptable. That is not how a country as wealthy as the United States should function. And so I really believe that we need to build on to the Affordable Care Act. I think that we need to make sure that the federal government is allowed to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to help drive down the cost of prescription drugs, to help drive down the cost of insulin. I think that there's so much that we can do to move forward, and that repealing the Affordable Care Act only takes us backward, and that is not a direction that we need to go. I think that it's really important to understand that a lot of what the president has been talking about as far as concerns about voter fraud by mail-in ballots are unfounded. I am a military spouse. The way that we traditionally have to vote is by mail, and no one has ever had a problem with it before. So it's quite interesting that now, when more civilian families need it, it's suddenly a problem. In Missouri, there are 3 ways that you can vote in November. You can show up at the polls on November 3rd and vote in person. You can also sign up to have an absentee ballot because you'll be out of the district, because you are affected by COVID, or for a host of other reasons, in which case you need to get that ballot notarized, and you can either mail it or deliver it to your county clerk's office. The 3rd way is by mail. And if you decide to vote by mail, you have to mail it back in through the United States Postal Service. And I think that having that accessibility is important, but I also think that it has been used to confuse people about the best way to vote if you're choosing not to vote in person. And so the number one thing we need to do is make it very clear to all citizens in Missouri how they can vote. Make it very clear where they go, what they're required to do, if they have to get it notarized, and the way it has to be resubmitted. As far as making sure that the vote stays safe, there is no reason to believe that it already isn't. And so I refuse to be drugged down by a president who simply wants to depress the voter turnout for political gain. We have to make sure that people have access. We have to make sure that people are safe. And we have to make sure that our post office is fully functioning so that the ballots get to where they are supposed to go by November 3rd. I would also just add that I think it would be really important for the state to make some adjustments as we approach the election. I think that one thing it really needs to do is make sure that ballots received after November 3rd, but postmarked before November 3rd, are still counted. And I think that when they are comparing signatures on those absentee and mail-in ballots, if it appears that it doesn't match, that voter should be contacted and able to fix that problem before discounting the ballot. That way we can make sure that everyone has a vote as is promised by the Constitution. My number one commitment that I can make to Missourians is that I work for you. My campaign doesn't take $1 from corporate PACs. This piece is so important when it comes to making real sustainable change. And it isn't a Republican versus Democrat take. It is a top versus bottom take. And what that means is, for so many years, if you were able to spend $10,000 on this politician or $50,000 on this politician, you own them. They're going to vote the way that you want them to. And that means that that politician no longer works for the people. They are no longer a public servant. They are a bought and paid for commodity. By rejecting that money and only taking money from actual human beings, I work for actual people who live here. And that is something that I think, regardless of your political party, you really should look for in your candidates. You really want to make sure that your candidates are responsive to you. You want to make sure that the person representing you has your best interests in mind, and that the group that your representative goes to for recommendations, for advice, for feedback, is actually representative of you, and not just coming in from lobbyists, not just coming in from millionaires and billionaires, and not just coming in from corporate interests, because those are the interests that will be served. The people at the top will continue to have what they have at the expense of the rest of us. And so my commitment to Missourians is that I will fight for my people, and that's it.